Today my lecture is going to focus on moving towards a global community psychology. After I finish my lecture, you will learn about the meaning and the need for global community psychology, know the limitations of Western approaches to psychology, identify the key characteristics of global community psychology, and you will also know about the developments towards community psychology in different countries. Let me give you a brief introduction about the need for global community psychology. Human survival and well-being is now embedded in an entangled web of global economic, political, social and environmental events and forces. Global events and forces now impact local events and forces. So the world has become the fabled global village. And the global village is multicultural, it is multinational and multi-ethnic. The scale, complexity and the impact of these events and forces constitute a daunting challenge for psychology as a science and as a profession. They demand a major disciplinary response, including a rethinking of psychology's assumptions, its methods, interventions, and a rethinking of psychology's roles in understanding and resolving the new technologies. People, societies and nations are competing for survival as contemporary life pits secular, humanist, scientific, technological, religious and spiritual cultural traditions against one another in a seemingly clashing struggle because of fundamental differences. Now these contradictions are becoming represented in our collective and individual psyches, leading to confusion and bewilderment. Let us define the global community psychology. According to Marcella, psychology can best respond to the emerging global challenges and opportunities by developing a new psychology that is responsive to our emerging global life contexts, conditions and consequences, which is a global community psychology. Now she defines global community psychology as a superordinate or meta psychology concerned with understanding, assessing and addressing the individual and collective psychological consequences of global events and forces by encouraging and using multicultural, multidisciplinary, multisectorial and multinational knowledge, methods and interventions. Global community psychology acknowledges the ethnocentricity of all psychologies and resists the hegemonic imposition or privileged positioning of any national or cultural psychology, except for the purpose of providing an explicit perspective for describing, understanding, addressing, predicting and changing global events and forces and their consequences. Global community psychology as presently defined prizes diverse psychologies and works against the inequities imposed by any power asymmetries. Even though the use of the term global may carry some unwanted and unimplied associations, symbolism and implications with the term globalization, she feels that global community is preferable to terms such as multicultural, international, world or cultural psychology because it better reflects the particular topical concerns and characteristics of our present global circumstances. Let's move on to the next concept, and that is reconsidering Western psychology's assumptions and methods. The economic, political and military dominance of Western society is rapidly spreading Western cultural lifestyles, values and priorities across the world, creating a westernized global psychology. This process can be considered a colonization of the mind. The West's economic, political and military power helps make its products and lifestyles appealing. The lives of virtually all the world's citizens have been opened to Western values, lifestyles and products through invitation, necessity or force. This global cultural homogenization raises serious concerns about the value of ethnocultural diversity. Although Western culture has its commitment to human rights, democratic values, and intellectual and social progress, serious questions can be raised about the wisdom of establishing a westernized global culture as a universal standard. Though psychology as a Western science and profession is responding well to the challenges of our changing times, this has not resolved the growing concerns of many Western, non-Western and ethnic minority psychologists. Gergen in 1996 with his colleagues have advocated reversing psychology's traditional subject, that is the researcher, versus the object, which is the topic dichotomy. Many non-Western psychologists are noting that the worldwide popularity of Western psychology, with its academic emphasis on the individual, objectivity, quantification, and narrow disciplinary specialization and universal truths, may be irrelevant and meaningless for the non-Western life context. They argue that the international organizations, training programs, research activities and publications remain rooted within Western psychology and thus cannot serve as a foundation for a psychology that is responsive to our present global context. So it is time to re-examine Western psychology within the global community context of our lives. With all that this may not imply for new assumptions, methods and interventions, and time for a global community psychology. Global community psychology can be distinguished as a superordinate or metapsychology by its concern for the following topics. 1. Socialization influences. Global community psychology asserts that global events and forces are becoming primary socialization influences throughout the world by creating new socialization contexts and forces, and by introducing different values and worldviews like that of recycling or conflict resolution or cultural awareness, family planning, etc. So as a result, local socialization values and contexts are being challenged. Secondly, ethnocentricity and cultural bias. Within the new global context of our lives, Western psychology will need to be repositioned as one of the many psychologies worldwide rather than as the only or dominant psychology. Mays recommended changing psychological theories and practices to meet the demands of multi-ethnic, multiracial and multinational society. This does not mean that Western psychology cannot be applied or used within different cultural contexts. It merely asks that the psychology's origins and influences be recognized and the consequences of it be handled judicially. Now, this is especially true for those specialty areas in Western psychology that are heavily loaded with psychosocial values, observations and practices. Ethnocultural diversity is very important for human survival, as is biological diversity, because it provides social and psychological options and choices in the face of powerful, unpredictable environmental demands. The widespread ethnic and racial violence in Asia was taken into consideration by Kishore Mahabhutani, a Singaporean intellectual who noted that Westerners cannot grasp the nationalistic fervor of Asia because their minds have never been wrapped in cell phone of colonialism. Moving on to the next, indigenous psychologies. Global community psychology encourages the development of non-Western psychologies. The political, economic and military power of Western nations disguises much of the Western psychology under a coat of universal applicability when it is largely cultural specific. Although Western psychology's growth and popularity around the world continue unabated, non-Western and ethnic minority psychologists are increasingly claiming that their culturally distinct experiences are not explained, described, or valued by Western concepts and methods. Gregan also criticized the universal applications of Western psychology's assumptions and methods in their call for a multicultural psychology. The next concept that I will talk to you is the cultural context of human action. For global community psychology, culture is considered a critical variable for understanding human action. Culture may be assigned a new priority in psychology's teachings, research, and service efforts. Too many psychology textbooks fail to discuss cultural variations in behavior and experience. As a consequence, much of what we teach and know is confined to the limited sectors of the world's population. Hall, an ethnic minority psychologist, concluded that psychology in the United States must be revised if it is to be made relevant to the multicultural world in which Americans live. She described Western psychology as culturally obsolete. Clearly, we must lodge our observations and our efforts to understand human behavior and experience within the cultural context. The next topic we are going to discuss now are the systems orientation and the complexity theory. Global community psychology endorses a systems orientation because it links global forces to microsocial, psychosocial, and biopsychosocial levels of behavior. Further, a systems orientation is similar to many indigenous psychologies in its emphasis on the embeddedness of different levels of life contexts and activities within ever ascending dimensions. Global community psychology also encourages the use and development of related theoretical orientations concerned with complexity, nonlinear and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches, including the complexity theory and the chaos theory. The recent development of these theories has limited their international use and applicability. However, there is every reason to believe that the future will witness increased uses, especially as new assessment methods and statistical analysis become linked to their premises and assumptions. Moving on to qualitative research. Among the qualitative research methods that have special importance in global community psychology are the narrative accounts, discourse analysis, ethnographic analysis, personal construct assessments, ethnosemantic analysis, participant observation, interviewing, and perspectives suggested by the feminist and minority theory. These approaches emphasize reflexivity between the psychologist and the topic. Each influences the other in a cyclical and the interdependent way. A compelling feature of qualitative approach is the increased accuracy it brings to research because it acknowledges the subjective. Increased use of qualitative research orientations and methods will enhance psychology's knowledge of context, meaning, and power asymmetries. Let's talk about education and training for global psychology. According to Marcella, a training program in global community psychology should include courses in such areas as the cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology, indigenous psychologies, global modeling, international relations, cultural anthropology, urban sociology and planning, community psychology, public health, international businesses, peace studies, future studies, economies, and human geography. It could also include coursework in systems, chaos, and complexity theories. The training must involve multicultural, multidisciplinary, and multi-sector premises, methods, and interventions. Now, this will ultimately promote intercultural, interdisciplinary, and intersectorial thinking. Let's talk about the next thing, which is that both scholars and practitioners can offer good opportunity to merge academic applied knowledge. Foreign language fluency and international travel would be among the core training requirements. As I have told you previously, qualitative and naturalistic research methods would be given a higher priority. It has been noted that the third world psychologists may require a different type and content of education and training. Next year I will teach you about the global subcultures. The growing breakdown in the viability of national governments and borders and the rapid emergence of pan-national and global cultural subgroup loyalties and affiliations raise the issue of global subcultures. Talking about global subcultures, with the stroke of the finger, people enter a cyber society that stretches across the globe, transcending national and natural borders. The new rules, symbols, and the activities constitute a new subculture that has powerful socializing influences. It constructs a new personal and group identity in a structured space. Because of its widespread use, the internet could be used to raise global consciousness among common challenges to sustainable economies, environmental preservation, and world peace. But at the same time, it is essential that we recognize that it is generating a new global subculture replete with its own psychology and behavioral patterns. Now I will talk about the unique developments in different national contexts. The 70s and the 80s saw the emergence of community psychology across the world. The origins and the focus of social change efforts differed by national contexts. In South Africa, opposition to apartheid was a unifying force. In West Germany, social movements for women and the environment played important roles. In Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, similar social movements were central to efforts to organize a new perspectives on psychology as well as disenchantment with the purely clinical concepts of human strengths and problems. Today, community psychology is a burgeoning international field. Learning from and working with indigenous people is a focus in several countries. For instance, the Maori in New Zealand, Aboriginal people in Australia, Mayan people in Guatemala. The Journal of Community and Applied Social Psychology carries articles from an international array of community psychologists. Training programs and practitioners now exist across Latin America, Europe, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, South Africa, Canada, and the United States. Let me now talk about moving towards a global community psychology. The development and practice of community psychology in 37 countries on 6 continents has been documented. In 2006, the first international conference on community psychology was hosted in Puerto Rico. This was an exceptional site for bringing together community psychologists from different traditions and different countries. Puerto Rico's unique history as a leader of community psychology in Latin America, many connections with the US community psychology were instrumental in linking community psychology traditions from different countries. The second international conference was held in Lisbon, Portugal in 2008, demonstrating the vibrancy of community psychology in Europe. At the third international conference in Puebla, which was Mexico in 2010, international exchanges continued to build on the rich traditions of community psychology in different countries, while struggling to articulate what a global community psychology might be. Now, at the fourth conference, which was held in Barcelona, Spain in 2012, where new conventions for presentations and cross-cultural exchange were conducted to support the development of community understandings of global community psychology. In addition to the sheer scope and complexity of current global events and changes, there is also the problem posed by their time-compressed speed and unpredictability. There are specific syndromes of distress and disorder associated with this problem, such as future shock, culture shock, acultural stress, rootlessness, and identity confusion. There are societal and group disorders such as the cultural disintegration, cultural dislocation, social disillusionment, sick societies, urban blight and decay, social fragmentation, cults, and cultural abuse and collapse. For psychologists, the many global events and forces confronting people today can offer new opportunities for developing and applying their knowledge. Psychologists, as knowers and helpers, can do many things to address the problems and possibilities emerging from our global community. Example: sustainable culture, environmental management, urban design, conflict resolution, healthy lifestyles, population control, humanitarian aid, and a civil society. They can assist in envisioning, negotiating, designing, and evaluating a humane social order and meaningful world peace. Let me summarize. Telecommunications, mass transportation, and linked economies have created a new global context for daily human life. Contradictions arising between fundamentally different perspectives become represented in our collective and individual psyches, leading to confusion. The economic, political, and military dominance of the Western society is rapidly spreading. Western cultural lifestyles, values, and priorities across the world, creating a westernized global psychology. This global cultural homogenization raises serious concerns about the value of ethno-cultural diversity. Although psychology as a Western science and profession is responding pretty well to the challenges of changing times, this has not resolved the growing concerns of many Western, non-Western, and ethnic minority psychologists. It is time to re-examine the Western psychology within the global community context of our lives. With all this may imply for many new assumptions, methods, and interventions, and a move towards a global community psychology. What are the characteristics of the global community psychology which I have taught you? 1. Recognizing the global dimensions and scale of our lives. 2. Limiting the ethnocentric bias in many existing theories, methods, and interventions. 3. Encouraging the development of indigenous psychology. 4. Emphasizing the cultural determinants of human behavior. 5. Using systems, contextual, and non-linear conceptualizations of human behavior. And 6. Increasing the use of qualitative, naturalistic, and contextual research methods. I have also talked about training for global community psychologists, which must involve multicultural, multidisciplinary, and multi-sectorial premises, methods, and interventions, and take into account the global subcultures. And finally, community psychology is now an international field. Community social psychology emerged in Latin America with a distinctive social change focus. Empowerment, feminist, liberation, and critical perspectives have become important perspectives, and collaborative participatory research methods have emerged.